All right. Greetings, everyone. My Gavan, and welcome back to my channel. Tonight, I have Morgan Daimler with me to talk about the diversity of fairies. Because one of the things that we wanted to get across tonight was just with our own experience, our personal experience, that we have seen kind of this idea, and I've heard about it in different ways, that fairies are only of Eurocentric nationality. And so we want to show you that there are fairies all around the world, and they have been known in many different cultures. And like some other types of fae communities out there, we are basically taking our stand to join in with them to help denounce the idea of white nationalism and that spread of the idea that it is part of the fae propaganda. And I'll explain here with the actual tribe of the oak. They said this: the unprecedented violence at the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021 has shaken the fabric of the United States of America and the world at large. These events leave deep scars on democracy and have threatened and even cost lives, and details continue to emerge and paint a terrible growing picture of the scope of the event. The tribe of the Oak Druid Order, Tuatha De Danann, condemns these acts of violence, terror, and white supremacy, along with the use of the historical symbols and emblems that have been co-opted in the name of hate and the oppression of others. We stand with all at this time who reject violence and oppression and pray for peace and understanding during this time of transition. 3 things which justice demands: judgment, measure, and conscience, which is the ancient Irish triad. Yes. So this is their statement saying that they have seen white supremacists actually use the symbol of the Triskelion and the different types of druid symbols, and they wanted to kind of separate themselves from that. And they are not alone. Actually, one other music group, actually from Sweden, Helung, I think that's how you pronounce it. They often are a metal band, kind of a folk metal band. They might be in that genre, and they wear antlers, and they are really very fae looking in terms of their style, looking very much like elves and forest people. And they wanted to put this statement out, and it said this: Helung has issued a statement on the alleged harassment of a Black woman at their Wednesday night, January 29th show at Webster Hall. Apparently, some people attended our ritual with the idea that Helung is only for white people, they write. This is not the case. Helung is for all people, regardless of the color of the skin. And we are sorry that this happened at our show. We do not tolerate hate speech and racism. And this is their statement in full below. The band had previously replied to a message on their Facebook page describing an alleged incident. And this is what they said: my Black friend went to your show tonight, the message reached. She loves the music and was enjoying the show until some racist wannabe Vikings went out of their way to express to her specifically that the show was for white people only, West European extraction, and not her, or presumably anyone whose ancestors came from anywhere else. She was made so uncomfortable at the show, she left. And some bands condemned violence at their shows. While I don't blame you for this or think you ascribe to these views, I think it's important that you make clear that these aren't who you're performing for, because this was an act of violence, even if no fists or weapons were used. And so Helung's actual statement was that it has been put to the attention of the band that a woman of Black color was harassed at one of our shows in New York. Apparently, some people attended our ritual with this idea. And this is not the case. Helung is for all people, regardless of the color of skin. And we are sorry that this happened at our show. We do not tolerate hate speech and racism. Anyone trying to fit the band into a political agenda of any sort has clearly not understood what Helung is about. That includes, but is certainly not limited to, white supremacy. Helung is none of it, and we will have none of it. We do not tolerate display of divisiveness and hate in the audience at our rituals. Heilung is about something much older than today's politics, which is why we do not include modern topics in our works. Heilung is about what brings us together. It's about what we have in common, not what divides us. Heilung is about spirituality, history, nature, and that one great being that was always there before people lived and named it. I thought that was a really beautiful statement, and it really made it very clear just how important it was for them to say that, you know, this idea of realm and a realm of fairy that they're trying to present in their music is really for everybody. And you too have come across this as an author of many different fairy books. Morgan Daimler has written quite a few books, and you can see her link in the description below. And you have come across this, I saw on a Facebook post where you talked about an author now. She has books now, but she was really kind of a social media blogger on fairy folklorist. Her name is Carolyn Emrick. Would you like to talk a little bit about her and your experience with that?
Sure. We can start there. And yeah, I'm 100% in the camp that we have to be very clear that this community is for everyone and open to everyone, and not meant just for specific groups or specific types of people. Carolyn Emerick was someone who comes from a folklorist background, as far as I know, and was writing articles usually about specific types of folklore. And then sort of over the course of time, within her articles started to include things that are considered dog whistles. And a dog whistle is a term for a phrase usually that is sort of used in white supremacist or white nationalist groups that would tell people reading it who were kind of inclined that way that this was for them, or, you know, in some cases can kind of help lead people in that direction. And those tend to be things about preserving specific ethnicities, or, you know, keeping Europe for Europeans, things along those lines. And then, you know, on her Facebook page, she just really ended up coming straight out as a white supremacist, was quoting Nazis, and it was quite a mess. And the reason that I had mentioned it on my social media is a lot of people aren't aware of this and don't follow her enough to know where her very strong, you know, opinions are. So people would like her material and share it or discuss it, kind of without realizing that in doing that, you're sort of dealing with someone who you maybe don't want to give that sort of attention to. And it is something, at least, you know, if you're reading things she's written, you do need to be aware that this is very strongly her position. And then, you know, decide for yourself from there. But, you know, I think it's an important thing to be aware of. So that was kind of how I had started discussing it. There's been a fairly decent sized movement on particularly Twitter among folklorists using the hashtag folklore against fascism, kind of to be very clear that folklore and fairy lore and things like that are not meant to be twisted and used in those ways. They're not meant to forward those agendas. You know, and I think that's something that we all need to be very clear about and constantly reiterate. It is for everyone, and it should be welcoming to everyone. And the fact that it isn't is something that we need to fix, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, because I was not aware of her, and I thought, you know, that the idea of fairies is just so, to me, it's worldwide. And I know that there are many different fairies around different cultures, and we're going to talk about that and kind of identify some of them for you tonight. And what ended up happening was I heard about her and I saw this and I was like, well, she's kind of limiting the spirit of fairy for everyone by really keeping it as just, this is part of the European ethnicity or lineage, and we're just going to I think she's making the argument that fairies and folklore and folk tales in that way belong only to the Europeans. Is that what she's basically saying?
In her later work, yeah, it definitely goes in that direction of this belongs exclusively to certain groups, and it needs to be preserved for those groups, and those groups need to be preserved, and that's definitely that sort of white nationalist agenda.
And the preserving is always like an interesting idea, because where are you going? But the preserving idea of fairy tales and folklore is she's saying that she wants to preserve it in a way where she wants to make sure that it's only seen in the light of being part of the European ancestry, and it belongs to those people, and that's it. I think that's what her preservation is more about,
Right.
rather than preserving the beauty of the folk tales. It's more about preserving the nationality of,
Right.
where the tales come from.
Right. Because I'm personally a huge advocate for preserving folklore and making sure that it continues and that these traditional stories continue, but not within a framework that they only belong to certain people who look a certain way or have a certain ancestry. They belong to everyone, but we do need to make sure that they continue. But that's definitely a separate thing, which is not where she seems to be coming from with it.
Yes, and that makes a lot of sense. And the thing is, like, what always bothered me and what was really heartbreaking was I was receiving emails from people that wanted to know more about fairies, and they were like, well, are all fairies light-skinned? And so this is a question that really does come up. And I have met many of just non-whites that basically say, hey, I'm a fairy soul, and I absolutely believe them in the way that they have been connected to fairies all their lives, and have that understanding. And so when I came across Carolyn after seeing that with you, I was like, well, this isn't really fair, and this is kind of opposite to everything that I've been saying as far as the elven kind of consciousness that Tolkien brings in his Lord of the Rings books is something of more of like a state of being that everybody can kind of achieve and can kind of aspire to, no matter where you're from. And I really do believe that the magic and the mystery of fairies are really all over the world. And in fact, I have a great book by Brian Froud, which is Good Fairies, Bad Fairies. I love this one. And
I love Froud.
Yeah, and he's also in that frame of mind where he understands that fairies are around the world. And I wanted to read fairy classifications to you all just to see this, but he says this: despite the fairies' disdain for rigid order, folklorists, historians, philosophers, mystics, poets, and many others have made numerous attempts to study, define, and categorize the fairy realm, if only to make it more comprehensible to humankind. In one basic worldwide system of classification, the denizens of fairy are divided into four major groups based on the elements: earth, gnomes, brownies, and kobolds; water, nixies, lamaias, and undines; and fire, salamanders, daemons, and fire drakes; and air, sylphs, peris, and other winged fairies. In Eastern philosophy, the classification system is more subtle. There are golden devas, who facilitate the transmission of solar energy or prana. There are white devas or sylphs, whose domain is in the air. And white meaning, and we can talk about that too, because the idea of white is not the color.
Right. It's not what people think it is.
Right. It's more of just a bright light without that indication of being Caucasian or anything like that. So that's where it's more shining ones. That's what they're saying. So the white devas or sylphs, whose domain is the air; the green devas or nature spirits, intimately involved with the growth of plants; and violet devas, who create and maintain the etheric structure of all things. The Anglo-Saxons, like many ancient peoples, classified the fairies by place: fairies of the forest and field, mountain and valley, lake and stream. The Welsh divide their fairies into small elves, gnomes or mine fairies, and brownies or household fairies. And it just goes on, and he talks about all the different types of fairies that you find around the world. And so I thought that this was wonderful. And if you want to know more about Brian Froud, I think that he's a really great example of somebody who understands the nature of fairies, and how it is really hard to distinguish them. And in fact, we can't even say that they're classified in the way that humans are classified by their ethnicity. They really can't be classified in that same way by skin tone. So I think that that is a really great distinction there that shows that. And even Tolkien, in his fairy essay on fairy stories, this is a great book on him basically talking about fairies. And this is an essay that he kind of put forth on basically a thesis about fairies. And this is about the origin. So he says, actually, the question, what is the origin of the fairy element, lands us ultimately in the same fundamental inquiry. But there are many elements in fairy stories, such as the detachable heart or swan robes, magic rings, and arbitrary prohibitions, wicked stepmothers, and even fairies themselves, that such can be studied without tackling this main question. Such studies are, however, scientific, at least in intent. They are the pursuit of folklorists or anthropologists, that is, of people using the stories not as they were meant to be used, but as a quarry from which to dig evidence or information about matters in which they are interested in. Perfectly legitimate procedure in itself, but ignorance or forgetfulness of the nature of fairy has led such inquiries into strange judgments. So I think what Tolkien was talking about here, and I think you understand this because I believe that you're kind of feeling the same way as Tolkien, and I feel it too, is that fairies can also be kind of perverted in the idea that they can, the meaning of them can be twisted, and it could become a political agenda or and even a nationalist kind of agenda for preserving a particular type of ethnicity. And that's exactly what we have seen in the Fae community, and why the Order of the Druids had to speak out, Halung had to speak out, and you even had to speak out, and I'm speaking out now too. And it seems that Tolkien was aware because he had to write a letter to the German Nazis at one point and say, no, my Middle Earth is not an Aryan propaganda. And he even called it, I have it right here, this is his letter to Michael Tolkien. I'm not going to read the actual letter that he wrote to the Nazis. I actually have a video called The Brave Tolkien's Brave Letter to the Nazis, and you could actually watch it. And I read you the actual letter, but this is what he said here, is this. I've spent most of my life since I was your age studying Germanic manners in the general sense that includes England and Scandinavia. There is a great deal more force and truth than ignorant people imagine in the Germanic ideal. I was much attracted by it as an undergraduate when Hitler was, I suppose, dabbling in paint, and had not heard of it. In reaction against the classics, you have to understand the good in things, to detect the real evil. But no one ever calls on me to broadcast or do a postscript. Yet I suppose I know better than most what is the truth about this Nordic nonsense. Anyway, I have in this war a burning private grudge, which would probably make me a better soldier at 49 than I was at 22, against that ruddy little ignoramus, Adolf Hitler. For the odd thing about demonic inspiration and impetus is that it is in no way enhances a purely intellectual stature. It chiefly affects the mere will, ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever accursed the noble northern spirit, the supreme contribution to Europe, which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light. Nowhere, incidentally, was it nobler than in England, no more early sanctified and Christianized. Pray for me, I need it sorely. I love you, your own father. And that was a letter that he wrote during the time of World War II, and this was June 1941. And you could see that he was getting upset with seeing this kind of Nazi Aryan propaganda. So this idea, and I actually found something really interesting on Tolkien's Gateway, that somebody wrote an article. I'll have to read the article one day. David Abada in the Chicago Tribune wrote this: "For years, Tolkien scholars have waged a fight on two fronts against an academic establishment that for the most part refused to take the author's work seriously, and against white supremacists who have tried to claim the professor as one of their own." Mm-hmm. So there is a big kind of topic around Tolkien's ideas. Like, a lot of people have tried to take Middle Earth and then try to take the characters of Middle Earth, the dwarves, the elves, the humans, the Easterlings, the orcs, and then they have put real human ethnicities to those people, thinking that it's some kind of direct reflection or an allegory. And even Tolkien himself, he said, no, that's not at all what he intended. And in fact, many Tolkien scholars have argued against that. So it really comes from this idea of just kind of preserving your own opinions and what you believe. And you could use Faerie to that way. And I think that some people have done that. Is that something that you have seen?
Oh, yeah. I think it seems to just be human nature to take anything that's popular or well-liked by people and to then try to use that to forward various agendas. And we could probably discuss for an entire hour the many historic examples of that. But I do think that when we look at the modern situation, I've had people try to argue with me about how the elves, the Alfar in the folklore, must be white-skinned Caucasian people, that Selkies, which are a seal people that we find in Celtic language-speaking folklore, must be very pale-looking, attractive white people. And, really, this is just not something that is supported when you look at the actual material. The biggest argument that people put forward when it comes to the elves have to be white is that if you trace the meaning of the word back far enough, particularly into Indo-European and Proto-Indo-European, the word probably did mean white. But it's not white in the way that we use it in the 20th and 21st century to apply to humans of a particular skin tone. It's literally the color white, and it also can reference, as we were talking about earlier, the idea of bright or shining. One of the definitions given for it in one of the Proto-Indo-European dictionaries is the color that you get reflecting off of water, which I'm sure we've all seen that at some point. So this idea that they're white in the way that a human being would be from the start is not really what that was ever meant to mean. But then, if we look at German and Norse mythology within the last 1,000 years and folktales, we find that when we talk about elves, we have these different groups that are mentioned, and some of them are clearly not pale-skinned. We have the Loisalfar, who are the light elves, as one group, but we also have the Dachalfar, which means like dusky or dark elves. And then we have the Svartalfar, which means black elves, literally black elves. Which, first of all, to me, if you're going to argue that the word elf must mean white, like a human color white, pardon my cat joining our conversation, that's not going to work from the very beginning, just because of that, because then it would be a very contradictory sort of thing we're talking about. It's pretty clear that that's not what it meant, because you can be dark or dusky for the Dachalfar, you can be black for the Svartalfar, and that would have meant literally black, like they compare them to black like coal or pitch. So again, not human color, but you can be those colors and still be shining, or have this light radiating from you. It's not directly connected to skin tone. And that, I think, is something that's very important for people to understand. And, you know, the same thing we talk about Selkies, these seal people that we find in Norse and also in Celtic language speaking folklore, people trying to argue that they must be, you know, fair skinned, you know, people. A lot of scholars think that Selkie stories started originally when people in these countries, in the Orkney Isles, in Scotland, in Iceland, were having random or unexpected encounters with indigenous people, possibly Inuit, for one example, in which case they clearly would not have been seeing someone who was, you know, what we in the West would call, you know, fair-skinned. This would have been someone who had a darker skin tone or a different skin tone. And that was where those stories could have come from, you know, according to several different scholars who've written about this. So to me, as soon as we're getting into this, there's so much evidence to contradict this idea. In English or British fairy lore, we have stories about fairies that are green, like literally green skinned, blue, red, black, all these different colors. You know, these are beings who are not human, even when they appear human, or even, you know, when we encounter them in human forms. That is just an appearance. That's just an external thing that we're seeing or perceiving. That's not what's actually going on. And a lot of them are referred to as shapeshifters. So we know that they can change their appearance. They can look different ways. So this whole idea that you would have to have a very specific inherent skin tone for a type of being just because they come from a certain area, to me, it's just flawed from the start. And there's so many examples we can find to sort of contradict it in the older folklore. It's not until the modern period where we start to see a lot of artwork coming out, I think, that it becomes easier for people to be like, well, all the art I can find just shows this. But that's just the artist's opinion. That's not necessarily what's really going on.
And there is a cultural difference in the way that that's exactly what it is, because if you go to South America, you have the Duende, you have those fairies, you have the Yoruba of Africa, you have the Aziza of Africa. That's another one I just discovered. It's a type of beneficent spiritual natural race in West Africa mythology, living in the forest. They provide good magic for hunters, and they also are known to have given practical and spiritual knowledge to people, including knowledge of the use of fire. The Aziza are described as little, hairy people, are said to live in anthills and silk cotton trees. And while the Aziza are usually described as a people, some traditions also refer to a single individual by name Aziza, which with similar traits, for example, which can describe small or single-legged man smoking a pipe. So it could be also known as like maybe spirits or something that they see and they can't really quite describe. And that's the thing, is like their type of folklore and fairy tales of having these types of experiences and wanting to speak about these types of beings, they passed it down through stories. It wasn't really through the kind of the art style that we see in Europe. So that's exactly it, is that the depictions of imagery that we have is really just all from, you know, all the European artists, and they're going to depict them with lighter skin tone. But all of the other fairies that are around, and you can even speak about some in I think you said Japan, right?
Korea, yeah. Yeah, we have a really good comment in the chat right now from Natty Lopez, who's saying she's from South America, and most fairy beings are described to be the colors of the environment, brown or green. And
and that makes sense because they're elemental beings. And so if you look at the world and you see, you know, you have the desert, you have the volcanoes, you have the waterfalls, the spirits and the energies that are related to these types of, I guess, origins on Earth,
Yeah, land spirits,
they
nature
will
spirits.
basically reflect that. And so there are fairies for every type of geographical area or origin and element of nature that we have. We have the sand fairies, and they're air fairies, the Peri of Turkey, but they're also kind of related to the sandstorms of the air. So it's a really interesting thing that you find actually these elemental spirits everywhere.
Yep.
And I'm so glad that you added that and shared with us that.
Yeah, that was a really good comment.
Yeah, that is a great comment, because they do take on basically different aspects of characteristics than humans do. And when I talk about the idea of being part of the Fae folk, it doesn't mean that you are only going to possibly have had maybe some fairy lineage from Europe, but you also could have had some fairy lineage from anywhere around the world, of having some kind of meeting of humans between all these different types of fairies around the world, and possibly there could be hybrids that way.
I mean, we definitely see fairy folklore, or we would, equate to fairy. They always have different names in different cultures, of course, but what we in English would call fairies around the world. It's sort of a global thing. Every human culture, as far as I know, has it. You'd mentioned a little minute ago about Korea. In Korea, you have the Yojang, who are, it's usually translated as fairy. They're very similar to what we would consider a fairy to be. You also have dokebi. That's usually translated as goblin, but honestly, it's a little closer, I think, to the more negative type of fairy that we might find in European folklore, as opposed to the Yoshang. It's a little more positive. So, this idea that you can find these sorts of beings, or very similar kinds of beings, it just seems to be a human phenomena. I shouldn't say it that way, because they're not. I didn't mean it. That did not come out right. It seems to be a phenomena that has some sort of symbiotic connection or relationship to humanity.
Yeah,
that sounds better. So that wherever you have humans, you're going to have these beings also showing up.
Yeah, because they're the personification of the nature and the elements that they live in those environments. So everywhere around the world, there's actually fairies. And it's just really important to remember kind of the spirit of fairies, which I really love how Tolkien, he really gets into it in this book. And I really appreciate, it's actually not a book, it's an essay, and his commentary and notes basically on fairy. But the idea of fairy realm is something far more mysterious and very, changeable and kind of undescribable in many ways, but it contains everything such as the sun, the moon, the trees, the river, everything. And everything that you can think of is contained in fairy. And even humans are contained in fairy when we are enchanted, that is what he says. And I love that Tolkien quote. And so it just shows that this spirit of fairy is, to me, it has always been an important, I think, piece of consciousness that people can tap into when they reconnect to nature, and when they understand their kind of origins and their roots. And it's just been a kind of a remarkable journey watching people kind of awaken to being connected to fairies and loving them so much, like as children, but also growing up with this affinity towards them as adults, and then even holding rituals and trying to communicate to fairies and connect to fairies and following the fairy craft. And I think that when we embrace a path like that, we're actually really awakening something really ancient and inside of ourselves. And just like what Heilung said, was that, our music is about something really ancient that we're all part of. It's not about, I guess, a particular type of ethnicity that should be, I guess, like maybe thought as that's that's the intention, because it's not. And I really love how they made those statements. And I'm so glad that we could talk about kind of the historical accuracy about fairies, the idea that they are not only in Ireland, Scotland and Germany, where we would see a lot of fake, fairy tales and folklore. But if you wanted to research, and I'm going to ask you about this, how would you, because I know myself, like I have some anonymous tales from the Celtic Ireland fairy tales, but sometimes it's hard to kind of dig. I mean, you have the online source, but sometimes things don't get transferred from written scrolls to the online library. So there are a lot of fairy tales and folklore that are part of other cultures around the world, and people want to know more about them. Like, say if they're from Japan themselves, and they want to learn more about those types of fairies that we're talking about, how would they go about doing their research into kind of looking deeper into their own culture, so they can kind of connect to the fairies within that culture and kind of understand and identify that fairy tale and that folklore within that?
Sure. And, like you were just saying, or like we've been saying for the last 5 or so minutes, this is a global phenomena. We had another comment in the chat about, in Australia, they're called mimis, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, but I have heard of that. And, in the United States, different Native American groups, you're going to have different names for these beings, but we also find them, all throughout here. And really, wherever you are, if you want to study any particular cultural expression of these beings, the best way to start, of course, is to try to see if anything has been written. Written sources can be a little dodgy, but it's still a good place to start. The best bet, if you can find it, is material that is connected to like a university or a school. In Ireland, there's this, it's online now, it's called DuchasIE, DUCHAS.IE. And it's a collection that was made by school children in the 1930s of folklore, local folklore. They wrote it all down. It's been digitized now and it's online. If you can go directly to people in the culture in question and talk to them, or find people who are on social media or making YouTube videos or anything like that, talking about these sorts of beings, that's also a really, really good option, because then you're getting it from people who are familiar with it, because it's part of what they've grown up with. It's part of the stories that they've grown up with, and their personal experiences. And there's definitely a lot to be found online. Some of it will be contradictory, which is part of the fun, I suppose. But the biggest thing to remember, if this is something that interests you, is, treat it like a quest. Approach it like something that you don't know how long it's going to take you to do it. You don't know if you're even going to be able to accomplish it, but it's the journey getting there that's where you're really going to learn the things you need to learn. And there's so many great resources out there for any culture. Pick a culture. Some that are a little more closed with their material, you just have to get to know people. If you make the effort, it is possible. Connect to the culture and, go forward from there. As we were talking about earlier before we officially started the show, culture is not genetic, no matter what anyone tells you. Anyone can be part of a culture if they make the effort and try. People can be raised in any culture, belong to any culture. That's another reason I have some issues with, for example, Emerick's approach, where she's sort of saying we need to preserve German culture for German people. That's sort of implying this assumption that a German person looks a certain way and has a certain skin tone, and that's just not true. There's a lot of people in Germany who are not necessarily going to look like that stereotypical, Nordic kind of person. that some people imagine. It's diverse, and if you grow up in a culture and have the language and have the culture and grow up with all those stories, then that's your culture, no matter what your ethnicity might be, no matter what your distant ancestry might be. And I think that's an important thing to mention in all of this too, because we do sometimes get this idea of like you have to have a certain ancestry in order to connect to certain things. And unless you're part of some very, very specific groups, very, very specific groups, that's just generally not true. Particularly when it comes to national cultures, nationalities. So, that's kind of my thoughts on a lot of this. It's open for everyone.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about this before, is that we both have experienced people kind of saying that they were not, I guess they were not feeling like included in the Fae community because of what they looked like. And so I wanted to do this to just absolutely show that historically is inaccurate, and that it's so hard to go through all of the types of fairies that are found around the world, because
I don't know if we have enough time to do that if we did a 24-hour stream.
Yeah, we really don't. And I did a video about like what are elves, and I talked about some of the elves and what they would call elves around the world. So I do have a video, one of those videos for you. So if you do want to watch it, it will kind of give you some of the background on some of the different beings. But this is something that I think that is really made for everyone. And I feel very strongly that the spirit of fairy is very it's very universal, and even part of other planets too, the idea of fairy, because fairy to me represents being very nature connected and elemental beings in kind of what they represent. But it is, like I said, it's like a place of consciousness, and that can be found on other planets as well. So I think that the idea of fairy is just, it's made to be very small when people put ethnicity to it, rather than look at it on more of a spiritual term and more of the energy, because a lot of times people try to make fairies more, I think, more material. And in that idea of, equating certain ethnicities to certain fairies, that is really humanizing them and making them more material, and really their spirit, and that's really what fairies are, their spirit, their energy. And this is something that's very different than, as Heilung said, the human politics of things. So I think that was really important. I got some comments that some people were really happy that we were doing this, because it's just something very near and dear to their own heart, that, maybe they grew up in a way of thinking that fairies could not be for them. But I really do believe that fairies are really for all. And I would argue that in many ways, all humans can really kind of embrace kind of their fairy nature. I mean, if I could, I would have everybody go through kind of this elven awakening. But this is a personal journey, and it's all on your own time to kind of remember your ancient roots, and then try to aspire to something more higher in the future too for yourself, in terms of your evolution. Because that's what I believe that the elves of Tolkien symbolize, not so much the elves and fairies of other times. Although I will say that the ancient elves and fairies of like Brian Froud, and even the old fairy tales, they had a type of wisdom. There was this very, very strong wisdom within them. And so even though they're not put into the same light as Tolkien did, we still very much can learn from those fairy tales and folklore. Sure. And even in the mischievousness of the elves and the fairies that you read, you still learn a lesson. And in fact, that's kind of what those tales are about. They're cautionary lessons for humans to know how to take better care of nature or to respect animals and other types of living organisms. And that's
Yep.
kind of what the role of a fairy is to be a teacher to humans in many ways. And as the Aziza in Africa was said to do, pass down knowledge and spiritual information to humans. So
Yeah,
I
I
love,
think
love
I
that.
think that really, where a lot of the problem comes in with what we're talking about is anytime people are trying to put fairies into a very narrow category, that's never going to work, because they are something that is kind of transcendent and something that really, from a human perspective, it's hard to completely understand or grasp. They're not a simple, straightforward, this is exactly what they are. It's a lot of things going on, and some things we understand and some things, people might not understand. But, as soon as you're trying to say, well, they have to be this one particular appearance, they're just so much more than that. And yeah, probably that one particular appearance is true, but there's so much other truth out there. There's so much more to it than just that one thing. And I think when you look at it from that sort of diverse, complex, multi-layered nature angle, that's when you start to see, what's really going on with it. And that's when you also start to realize that it is something that is not just for one particular ethnicity, one particular nationality. It's something that transcends. It's something that is there for everyone, depending on how you want to relate to that.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And that's exactly it. Is like, I always tell people if they write me and they're like, well, can fairies look like this or can fairies look like this? And I say, think about infinity
Mm-hmm.
and then think about all the infinite type of forms that you can imagine a fairy to look like. That's what fairy realm is. It holds all of the possible potential of combinations of spirit and energy, and it will manifest into either a physical being or it will be pure light. And that's basically what I see fairies as. They are a combination of, deer bodies with human other halves, and they're floating little butterfly or sylph type fairies. There's so many different types of beings. It's just unbelievable to even try to imagine. And I think
Oh,
that
yeah.
gets me so overwhelmed. Is I love that it really, to me, fairy symbolizes the ultimate diversity. Like
Mm-hmm.
it symbolizes diversity in all of its respects, and that really is a reflection of nature. When you look at all of the different species of plants and trees and flowers that we have, well, just imagine that we have all those different types of species of fairies that kind of can even be maybe personified by all those different types of species of fauna. And it's amazing when you think about it. And I think that if we can remember the infinite nature of fairies, then we won't make it into kind of a smaller, narrow category as people are. What would you say to, I guess, to those out there that, because we don't want to take away their sense of pride, right? Everybody should have, it's, to me, pride or nationalism, if you are not in a place where you want to be superior over others, it's a type of self-love. And it's okay to be confident about where you're from. I mean, that's great. But what would you say to those that, maybe had it in their mind that fairies only came from Europe? And how would you gently help them kind of through the process of trying to open up their mind to other types of fairies around the world?
I mean, I think the thing that I do usually say to people is just that a lot of times the stereotypes that we have, the ideas, these preconceived notions that we have about even what is a particular country, what do people from a particular country look like, A lot of times, even just from a purely human point of view, that's not accurate. There's a lot more diversity out there than we necessarily want to see, because humans tend to like simple and straightforward. And when we're talking about fairies, I think really the key is to just understand that they're always going to be more than what we perceive them to be. So yes, we might see them, if we see them, in a particular way because that's what's comfortable for us, and that's how they're going to relate to us because that's what we expect. But that doesn't mean that that's the totality of what they are. A lot of them are known to be shapeshifters. A lot of them, like you said, have this connection to this idea of shining or light. Some of the euphemisms we find for fairies are things like the shining ones. And they transcend our simple concept of ethnicity or of skin color. They're sort of beyond that. And if there's any one lesson that I do think that fairies in a general sense would want to convey to humanity in a general sense, it's to look beyond that surface appearance and understand that depth and that diversity and that complexity, and not try to narrow it down into just one simple thing. So, if you're coming from a place where you've always thought, well, fairies must, elves must look this one particular way, I think the biggest thing I would say to that, honestly, is maybe give some thought to why you think that. And particularly given how widespread these beliefs are, we know that these beliefs move around. We know that, for example, when people in Ireland left and came to the United States, came to Canada, went to Australia, that they brought these beliefs with them and had encounters with these beings, and took the folklore with them. And we have folkloric accounts of Irish fairies in the United States and in Canada. These things are so much more fluid and so much more flexible than any narrow category could ever make them. And I would just encourage people to really give some thought to that, and to why we need to fix them into this one very specific form, and not acknowledge them as greater than that, beyond that.
I love that. And I'll add this one quote that you reminded me of with Tolkien's. He had a valedictory address to the University of Oxford in 1959. I have the hatred of apartheid in my bones, and most of all, I detest the segregation or separation of language and literature. I do not care which of them you think is white. Mm-hmm. So that right there, Tolkien was saying that he didn't want to separate the idea of literature in general to just to delegate it to the white folks, but he wanted it to really embrace kind of the wisdom and the messages behind the fairy tales for all of the world, because that's how everybody learns, that's how everybody grows. We cannot do this as islands in our own nations, but we all together have to somehow get the same information in many ways, and then we take that information and we evolve together. And I really do believe that the fairy energy is just as strong today as maybe it was in the very early stages of when all these fairy tales and folklore were coming out. I think that it's really stronger today because the messages behind, like you said, look behind and beyond just the surface value of people and see the spirit and the soul is so important, and something that we need to remember in today's world. And the fairies can teach us to do that. And I believe that kind of awakening to your own, fae nature within your elven soul, if you want to say you reincarnated from the elves, that in a way is you just remembering that part of you that does look beyond and that can, like you said, think bigger and expand the consciousness in the way that you definitely talked about. And I think that's the greatest lesson really that the fairies can give us. So let's go to the comments and see, because I know that we answered some. Thank you for checking on the side here. It's so great to see everybody. Thank you for all jumping in. And some of you are giving some names of different types of fairies from other cultures. Like we had the Mimis and Natty. Thank you so much for the South American reference to the fairies. It's wonderful. Musical sorcerer Bess was a dwarf god of ancient Egypt. And I did not get a chance to read it because I didn't want to make this too long, but even Tolkien said that the very first fairy tale that he could find, because even though he says the origins of fairy tales and fairies are basically very ambiguous, that there's really no one set origin. You can't really claim that it started in Europe. And he actually said that one of the very first fairy tales was about a heart and an exchange of a heart, and it involved like a lotus flower and a bird, and it was basically a fairy tale teaching a lesson, and it was from ancient Egypt. So Tolkien definitely would probably know about that dwarf god Bess. I'm sure he did his studies. And the Mayans were waiting for the tall ways to come back, the tall ways. You know, I want to say, I think that fairies, to me, I believe that we can think of them just as infinite and diverse as we would think extraterrestrials are. Because a lot of times it happens with aliens too. Aliens from other planets get very kind of segregated into their own little categories of what they look like. And we have to think about them as beings that belong to other civilizations like this world, that they wouldn't be all homogenous and look exactly all alike from one particular planet. Possibly they could. There could be some species of life that could look like that, but there's a diversity in life. There's a diversity in nature that is there. And I think it's just really exciting the more and more we think about that, in terms of that connection between how many extraterrestrials there would be in this known universe or even unknown universe, and then equate that to kind of the realm of fairy in the spirit light body existence, and you get your idea of just how diverse fairies are too. And yeah, I thought that was a good correlation there.
Yeah. We have a couple comments from James Young. He's asking, do elves worry about their color? No. Are some of them racist? No. I mean, I've never run across an anecdotal account or in folklore or, personal experience, anything that you want to call it, accounts of fairies or elves treating humans based on the color of the human. They don't seem to be super concerned with that, which is another reason I say this is something that's for everyone. Humans seem to be the ones that get caught up and tripped up in the idea of the colors, skin colors of beings. But that does not seem, as far as I have ever seen in all of my research and experience and all of that, that's never been an issue that I've seen coming up. The idea of fairies being weird about humans' skin colors.
No, and in fact, I do have something to say about that, because so Tolkien was sometimes criticized for creating kind of a racial divide between his characters of the elves and the dwarves that didn't get along. So a lot of times people tried to put some, I guess, connotation there that the elves are one race and the dwarves are another. And they, there's racialism there, like that the elves think they're better or the dwarves think they're better. Well, this is what I actually found. Tolkien portrays racism within the heroic races as unabashedly negative. Elves and dwarves distrust each other, and some elves hunted the petty dwarves as animals at first. as did the Rohirrim to the Woses. The friendship between Legolas and Gimli is portrayed as unusual but commendable, and more of a positive way of kind of expression and behavior between the two races. So he was actually saying that the way that the dwarves and the elves were not friends, that was kind of unnecessary foolishness and kind of ignorance in some way, like, because it was a misunderstanding. Basically, Thingol was killed early. Thingol, the Elf King, was killed by the dwarves early on, and there was this whole misunderstanding then that basically dwarves were not to be trusted, and the story was very confusing because either side didn't understand whether Thingol started it or whether the dwarves started it.
Right.
So Tolkien was doing that on purpose because he was showing kind of this ignorance and foolishness that is in racialism when you're dividing yourself and separating yourself by your ethnicity and keeping yourself from just having friends, keeping yourself from just being able to relate to others. So that's why he showed Gimli and Legolas becoming friends, because that's the message that he was trying to get across, that it's more of a positive, more of a wiser thing that Legolas did than what the elves and the dwarves did to each other in the past.
In general, yep.
Yeah, so that right there proves that he was definitely trying to make that message against racism, whereas some people try to say that he was trying to promote segregation, but he wasn't at all. It's just a different way of interpreting things. But when you look deeper into the context and when you look at the person, I think then you can get more of a clearer understanding of what they were meaning.
Yep.
Oakirk, I'm sorry, Oakirk, you had a comment. If elves had to look a certain way, drows or night elves, etc., wouldn't be the color they are. Diversity is important, so it can make the minorities feel included. Yeah, I mean, it would be true. It would be more kind of to take on the color of the environment, and it's not necessarily like we said, it's not part of the human politics or the idea of this like strong nationalism within. It's more like, I'm going to look like the forest because I can blend in with the forest. Take on those types of elements and traits within.
So you have these beings who are tree brown or foliage green, or these different things that fit in where they're trying to fit in. That makes complete sense.
Yeah.
I mean, the Drow gets a little complicated. I don't know if we have time to really super get into that, but it did have some racist issues with it, the Drow originally being brought out in role-playing games in D&D, which they've addressed, and they've changed it so that if you play a Drow character, you're not inherently evil. Because they sort of acknowledge that, where it started was maybe not the best place. But the Drow are actually based, I think, on the Svartalfar, the Black Elves of Norse mythology, who were also not inherently evil or bad or anything like that. It wasn't like the Lystalfar were good and the Svartalfar and the Dalkalfar were bad. They were just different groups, and they had different affinities. They lived in different places. I think we definitely have always seen this idea that there's a lot more out there, a lot of variety out there.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good question. James had, what is it about color that makes a person racist? I mean, that's a very complicated question, but
that would take a whole hour to answer.
Yeah, I really think that it has a lot to do with just the idea of self-preservation, like I talked about in another video. It's just this idea that you need to preserve your bloodline, and some people have that in them and some people don't. Like Carolyn Emrick, she's a good example of that. She keeps on saying that we need to preserve the European bloodline because I think in her mind it's becoming mixed with immigrants, and so there's this idea that when the Caucasians mix with others of other colors, then they're going to kind of muddle up the bloodline or the lineage. And so there's this self-preservation for certain people, and I understand that, but at the same time, how far are you going to go where you're going to start to insult people and also close yourself off to other relationships that you can have with others of different colors. And so there's a lesson in that. And I think it is a personal journey. I think that we could probably answer that question in many different ways because it really depends on the environment of where people grow up in. I'll say this, and then Morgan, you could say something if you wanted to say something on that. The idea of self-preservation, I'm going to do a video called, because I think that it's important. I'm getting more into the idea of how technology is really, it's growing, and it's growing because of the gifts of nature. And there is something called CRISPR, which is basically a gift from nature itself, where it's an organism that has helped scientists understand the DNA sequence. And they have kind of completely mapped the DNA traits and sequences of what humans have and what even animals have within them. So nature has this ability to help us understand scientifically what everyone is made of. So self-preservation is actually a very old idea that existed when we didn't have the technology and the science to understand, well, what brings back an extinct species. In fact, with CRISPR, you can bring back any extinct species. And so I'll talk more about that because it's really exciting what technology is going to bring through using nature and understanding nature. And then this idea of self-preservation is not going to be an issue any longer. So that's something that they can think about too, I think. Those who are racist and have any kind of fear, technology will probably show a different interpretation in terms of, basically you never have to worry. Your people will never be wiped out. That as long as we have the genomes and like kind of the maps, the blueprints of DNA, the human species in all its different varieties can always go on, basically. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting video. I'll definitely be doing that, but I just wanted to add that to it. I have one for you, Morgan. Llewellyn. What Morgan is saying, it has never been an issue that I've seen or experienced. Gender is different than race, of course, but it is different.
Oh yeah, Anya. Yeah.
Anya?
Yep. I agree. I think that was something going on in the chat over there. Getting into the racism thing, I think that really does come down to fear. Fear and power. So it's this idea that people are afraid. They're afraid of people that don't look like them, people who they don't necessarily understand for various reasons. And a lot of times, particularly in places that have institutionalized racism, it is also about power. This idea that if those people who don't look like me have a better situation, then it has to mean my situation is worse, instead of seeing it as everyone should be in a better situation together. And when you have that sort of fear, I think that's what makes people lash out and sometimes do really horrible things, instead of trying to understand and trying to learn, trying to be open to just the way other people do things. You don't have to change the way you do something just because someone else does it differently, but you also don't have to make them change either. You can acknowledge that there's beauty in diversity. There's the thing that makes the world the wonderful place that it is that we have so many different cultures. We have so many different approaches to things. We have so many different people, and that's a really beautiful thing. But I think it's too easy to be afraid of what we don't understand, or like you were saying, that idea of preservation. It's generally been shown that that's really not an issue, but it's a fear. It's something that people are afraid is going to happen, and so they do these things that are hateful or angry, because of that fear, instead of trying to find better approaches to it. Like realizing that fear is controlling you, and that you need to move through it and past it, and realize you don't need to have it. Take a better approach with it.
Absolutely. And Anya, if we wanted to discuss the gender is different than race, of course, but it is different. Also, too, with gender, that's something that I definitely think, too, is that fairies can be ambiguous, too, in gender. That, you have some feminine, you have some maybe masculine, but then you have kind of this ambiguous, you don't know. And so the idea of the spirit realm in that way is that, yes, gender is without form in many ways. And so you won't see a clear-cut definition sometimes of what is, to your eyes, what's female or what's male. And you see that a lot in some of the fairies and the folklore. Is there any in particular, Morgan, that you can think of that are ambiguous? Because I just have this intuitive understanding about the ambiguity, and I've seen it before, but do you have any?
There's a lot of modern examples of it, which I think is a wonderful thing. Historically, what we tend to see more in the older folklore, which of course was preserved and written down and told in a time when the whole understanding of gender was very different than it is today. But what we tend to see then is this idea of, for example, and this would be the Anglo-Saxon elves, that they were described as sort of effeminate or in feminine terms, but they were also very masculinely sexual. I don't know how else to say that correctly. So it's this sort of inherent, they look in a way that contradicts what the culture at the time would have expected for someone who is super masculine, but then they act in a way that is, something we would consider to be sort of typically masculine. And we see that with the women too. We see stories of these, sort of warrior fairy women that would have not been what you would see in women in those cultures at the time. So it's this idea of that ambiguity being expressed through this contradiction with what the cultural expectation was at the time for specific genders, which I realize is a very complicated way to say that, but it's just a different way, whereas today we see it more in literal androgyny and beings that are not clearly male or female and maybe not overtly sexual. So it's kind of manifested differently in what we find today. But there's definitely a long history of fairies not adhering to human gender norms.
Yeah, I see a little bit of that ambiguity with Tolkien's elves, where they are masculine, but maybe there's a little bit of more kind of feminine qualities that maybe you would see in the human race of Middle Earth. So it seems that the elves are a really nice mix of both the feminine and the masculine, and more in balance and okay with that balance within their community and within their realms. Like, they don't have misogyny or, this type of kind of ultra feminism that kind of hurts or causes discord in the community. They're very different in the way that they relate to each other. They respect the different balances of, feminine, masculine. And I just absolutely love that, because I just think that once again points to kind of a higher road that humans can take, the way that they the way that they respect each other as female or male or non-binary or more ambiguous in nature. And I think we can learn a lot by the fairies with just the idea of the gender. In fact, I had a video which I put out about transgenders, that I really do believe that when you if you ever are friends with any transgenders or non-binary souls, they have a little bit of a fairiness quality to them. They really do. Some of them do. And I've actually have met quite a few on my channel. So in many ways, they're part of this kind of to teach humanity how to look beyond the surface and how to go beyond just, normal labels. And in many ways, they can be our teachers. So just like fairies in many ways.
Sheena has a good comment in the chat about fairies don't seem to worry about humans' clear-cut definitions and rules. They have their own. Yes. And I would 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that that's another example where they're clearly operating in a system that's sort of beyond, or, I don't want to say above because that makes humans sound bad, but they're in a place that's ahead of, forward of where a lot of humanity is right now when it comes to these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And this idea that they don't have to be stuck in specific roles or expectations. They have their own thing going on.
Absolutely. They are far more free in their nature and in their spirit. And like you said, they're not going to be tied down to some of these laws or these rules that humans put and limit themselves in many ways. And I think that's why if you feel like you're a fae soul, you're an elven soul today, you might be somebody that feels a little bit of resistance against some of the limitations that humanity's society has. So I think in some way that makes you resonate with the fairies if you're somebody that feels somehow kind of constricted or limited in nature by some of the laws. That's why, and not in a harmful way, but more in a way of just the categorizing people, the putting people into boxes. If you are against doing that, then that's very fae in spirit, as Morgan was saying, because it really is about not having, that type of, I guess, that narrow mindset that happens and that limitation. So yeah, I'm glad you said that because that is so true, Sheena. So thank you so much for joining in and putting out your wisdom. Let's see if there is any other one. Oh, here's a good one. I had another. Nope, I think we're pretty good. I think we really kind of nailed everything. Just the idea that we wanted to kind of help show the diversity of fairies today, and I think we did that.
Yep. I think our big takeaway message is whatever your human skin color is, whatever your human gender identity or sexuality or any of that is, this is still for you. Fairies are for you. Folklore's for you. Tolkien's for you.
Absolutely. Because remember, it really is skin deep. All of everything that fairy represents, it comes from within your heart and within your higher mind. And, it really is skin deep. So it goes way beyond the color of your skin. So we're so happy to be able to talk about this tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again, Morgan. It was wonderful to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I think this is such an important topic to address. So I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it.
Absolutely. I'll see you all next time. Namarie.